hope that you get plenty of takeaway messages relating to behavioural challenges during times of employment absence and financial uncertainty into this presentation. Obviously, there's a lot of information circulating about, these are very unique times that we're living in. But what we've tried to do is look at similar cases where there's been periods of uncertainty, unemployment, and look at the impact of what they've had and try to translate that into today's presentation. We're going to be explaining some of the potential behavioural challenges during return to work, post self-isolation and furlough from COVID-19. We're going to be describing some of the human emotional construct patterns pre and post self-isolation. So generally what we're trying to say there is how people were feeling prior to the coronavirus and everything that we're all going through at this moment in time, and also what state of mind might they be in when they return to work, whenever that's going to be. We're going to also be looking at some of the risk management tools and theories that can help put interventions in place. And I would imagine that's why many of you guys have signed on to this webinar today, to try to take away some tools, some techniques to think about when you are returning your employees to work. And also we're going to be looking through Scott through the lens of human factors and describing some of the key features relating to non-technical skills, such as leadership, communication, situation awareness, stress, anxiety management, all these behavioural constructs. So the first thing I'd like you to think about is, I would normally take a bit of a straw poll at this point and ask anybody if they were clever enough to tell me what this term actually means, DNA. And this is to do with your organization, but for the purposes of today, it's not so much your organization, it's your people within it. So DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, what is it? Well, there's a definition. Two chains that are coiled around each other and are used in the growth, development, functioning, and reproduction of all known living organisms. Now, the reality is we use this model within Gauge Solutions as an alternative to the standard plan, do, check, act model. So what we try to say is, from a business point of view, how does your business grow? How does your business develop? How does your business function? And how does your business reproduce? But for the purposes of today, I'd like you to think about DNA as your people, yeah, your people within your organization. Any organization's most valuable asset to help make the organizational DNA is their people. So this webinar is not so much focusing on a business, it's about people. And please bear in mind that when we talk today about people coming back to work, that includes managers, chief executives, directors, right the way through the hierarchy of a business, because all people have human emotions, and what we're going to be talking about today applies to all those levels. So I'm going to come back to this as the very final slide, just to get you thinking about, some of the questions we're going to be asking in relation to the people within your organization. So I mentioned earlier on about some of the research that's relevant to self-isolation and periods of furloughing and returning people to work. What I didn't want people to think about is, this is Glenn or Scott's opinion. This is a lot of what we're talking about today is evidence-based, and we're trying to sort of simulate a very unique situation that we're all going through at the moment, but also try to correlate it to COVID-19 and those similar experiences that this tries to demonstrate that people will go through. And a lot of what today is going to be based around is something called the Yerkes-Dodson law. And that's the relationship between arousal, and for the purposes of this, think about how busy a person is and their performance. We're going to be talking about the effects of anxiety on personal cognition. So anxiety disorders, impact on concentration. We're going to be looking at job insecurity, distress, and its link with insecurities regarding employment, decision-making experiences during economic distress, financially motivated business decisions as a result of budgetary constraints, employees' fear and ongoing loss of earning potential. Also, very importantly as well, staff motivation through the process of furlough. It's very interesting this morning, actually. I was listening to my local radio station, And one of the guys who's normally quite a, a very upbeat sort of a chap, he was talking about how he suddenly in the last couple of weeks started to develop bad habits about sleeping in of a morning. He's maybe drinking a little bit more, or treating himself to a glass of wine earlier in the day than he would normally be doing. And he said he's finding himself that he's getting into an area of a complete lack of motivation. And he's snapped out of it. But I think the longer this goes on, that's something as risk management professionals we're going to have to deal with. And we're going to show that sort of empirically this morning using that Yerkes-Dodson law at the top. 15 tips for staying sane while in an unemployed position. I mean, not particularly good use of words there, but that's what the research calls it. And it's all about, it's very hard to maintain standards of motivation through prolonged unemployment for those used to being in full-time employment. And I'm also very cognizant of the fact that some people aren't unemployed, some people have been furloughed, some people are in working in self-isolation, social distancing. As I said earlier on, a whole range of new vocabulary that we've had to start to use, that a lot of this we weren't aware about 4 or 5 weeks ago. And then finally, changing behaviour is an incredibly complex subject. But what we're going to do is sort of, look at the behavioural change wheel and a guide to helping you guys design interventions. So it's some work that's been done by a group of clinical psychologists, and it was predominantly aimed at the sort of the hospital environment. So we're going to be using that today, and I would really signpost you to that book, to have a look at it and see what you think, because it goes through a systematic process of certain behaviours that you desire and how to get them through intervention functions. So I hope that's useful. So we've already talked about this Yerkes-Dodson law, or the inverted U model as it's often referred to. You can see there on the vertical axis we've got performance. So that effectively is how well somebody's performing in the workplace. What we've got along the horizontal axis is arousal. And by arousal, what that means is how busy a person is within the workplace. And what Yerkes and Dodson discovered way back in 1908 is that in terms of the busier people become, the better their performance is, right? So what it kind of says is it's good for people to be busy. And as the level of arousal increases, so too does their performance, to a point where you get to optimum arousal. Busy and focused is optimal performance. So what it's kind of showing that when you set to work on a morning, and it's exactly the same if you simulate this to an exam, you don't do the hardest questions in an exam first. You read through the paper, you try to get the easiest ones out of the way. Once your mind starts to stimulate itself, then you get into your area of peak performance where you should be tackling the good questions. And I've used this model with my own children, and it works. It's a good technique. And I also used it when I was in the Royal Air Force and military, and I used to, as an aircraft engineer, what we would never do is deploy somebody on doing a really safety critical task first thing on the morning on an aeroplane, because they are not anywhere near aroused enough to doing something that's critical. And we work with a lot of our clients using this model to think about at what time in the day are you setting your employees to work on safety critical activities, and you could be doing it when they're under aroused. So there is a counter to this, of course, and that is when people are overworked or they're stretched. And that's when you start to get people feeling anxious, they become stressed, often depressed, and a lot of mental health and well-being issues start to emanate. So that very kind of crudely is how the Yerkes-Dodson law kind of works. And what it says is it is good for people to be busy. The less aroused people are, the lower their performance is going to be. So let's take that to your workplace then. So if you think about this, prior to the coronavirus striking, where would the people, in fact, where were you? You know, there's a lot of people on this call today, and I would ask you to say, where would you put yourself on this performance graph? So are you one of the top 10 performers within your organization? Are you someone who's just good? And there's nothing wrong with that, a really good performer. And within most organizations we work with, predominantly, that's where many of the employees sit. Really good people. Yeah. Unfortunately, we do have a few of these people who are allowed to work with us. Excuse me for a second. But I would imagine in many of your organizations that's a few. And unfortunately, we do have some people here as well, you know, who are at work suffering with many forms of mental health and well-being type issues, who need support. And that obviously become more and more prevalent within the last year or two in terms of mental health and engagement. So again, you know, I'd ask you that simple question, you know, to think about where would you put most of your workforce? Would you have segments? Would you have pockets? Where would you put them predominantly? And indeed yourself. So what's happened then? Well, as you can see, I'm going to let this slide build up. About a month and a half ago, this is what everybody is being subject to. These are the sort of headlines. You know, people having to survive sudden unemployment. We're talking about more and more people getting killed or dying every day. Yes, it's gone down, it's gone up. There's unemployment. We're getting pictures like this of fantastic NHS workers on the front line. Our own Prime Minister in the UK has been in hospital. People not doing maybe what they're supposed to be doing. A global recession. You know, safety issues in big players. And then we talk about, you know, a third of our sort of GDP in terms of what we're going to be used to in the UK is going to be hit, possibly even more. And then we're constantly getting these messages, you know, stay at home, protect the NHS and save lives. And then finally there, you know, I think a very important message from Her Majesty the Queen, we should take comfort while that we may well have more to endure, better days will return. And that's really what I want to focus on today with Scott, about when those days do return, whenever they do, we are ready for them and we're ready to hit the ground running. So we're going to go back to the model and think, bearing in mind, you know, what I've just tried to show, these constant messages of what people are getting via LinkedIn, via newspaper articles, via the news. When your people go back to work, including yourself, how many of them are going to be in that top performing zone? How many of them are going to go straight back to being really good and switched on? You know, you imagine, you know, the day that the whole process is allowed to be sort of brought out of isolation, and suddenly you've got a holiday booked to Tenerife. You know, hands up all those people who want to get onto that plane with a pilot who hasn't flown for 4 months. You know, hands up who wants to get onto an aeroplane that potentially hasn't had the usual level of service that it's had. Are the people who are going to be maintaining that equipment or flying that aircraft, indeed, are they going to be at their peak of performance? An Olympic athlete, you know, winning a gold medal, being in isolation for a month, 2-3 months, and then go and run in the same time, it's not going to happen. And you might find that a number of your employees are going to be in this zone here when they return back to work. Their performance may have decreased, resulting from less physiological or mental arousal during period of absence. Furloughs causing lack of self-confidence and job insecurity, lack of motivation from prolonged unemployment, self-isolation causing panic, stress, anxiety, and fear of returning to work. There may even become a disconnection. There's going to be a number of people who have maintained in the workplace. And, you know, some people might be thinking, well, why was I furloughed and my colleague wasn't? So the research suggests that when that has happened in the past, there becomes a disconnect between those who were furloughed and those perhaps who weren't. Hyperarousal, people overthinking things, running distortion patterns, fear of ongoing loss of earning potential. And also a big one there about managers, directors, you know, C-suite executives making business decisions that are financially motivated. And if that does happen, what corners will be getting cut? So all things to think about. So physiological and emotional explanations. I've tried to give a sort of pictorial representation here. People won't remember everything, that they won't be as sharp as they were. You know, P&L, people's personal finances, people, you know, worried about job security, all these headlines, people like this guy here, threatening people who didn't turn up for work will be sacked when they come back. You know, people suffering with the, you know, sadness of loss of loved ones, you know, and people who died from this horrible virus, those suffering with post-traumatic stress disorder. You know, some people might be suffering with, you know, certainly from the Royal Air Force and going through the Gulf War. I know a lot of people who struggled with survivor syndrome. We've heard a lot in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen about domestic violence and how that's impacted on families who are not used to being together so often. Also, profit and loss. There's so much more than what I can actually show on this screen. But all of these impact on a human being's psychological, emotional constructs. And it's up to us as risk managers to think, how can we help? How can we ensure that when these people, these great people that we have, go back to work, we don't end up with a RIDDOR rate with a HSE that goes through the roof, or even worse, where people have that serious an accident, we end up with fatalities, you know, people getting seriously injured, etc., etc. So all of these things really important. And in terms of a bit of research, just to share with you, Scott was kind enough to share this with me just yesterday. So I put this into the presentation just this morning, and I thought you might be interested to see this. This was a straw poll of 1,024 members, and I think it was LinkedIn members, and it's a sort of a workforce confidence index. And what it kind of alludes to was, on a scale of minus 100 to 100, what was the UK workforce confidence level? And it came out as 13%. You know, that's not particularly high in anyone's scaling. Those at director level or above, plus part-time employees and the self-employed and job seekers, have a much less positive outlook. You know, I was quite surprised when I saw that, you know, sort of C-suite executives and directors feeling like that. Nearly a quarter of the respondents said that they will, in the next 2 weeks, increase the amount of time they spend searching for a new job. Some 35% of respondents said their income had decreased in the past month, with the self-employed seeming to be the hardest hit. A whopping 75% reported a drop in an income over that period. Some 59% of those surveyed said their companies are offering the chance to work remotely, but only 42% of those people have been provided with the necessary equipment to do so. You know, so a lot of work, you know, in terms of workforce confidence, there's a lot of things for our employees to be really mindful and cognizant of, and what we need to be thinking of as risk managers, or indeed managers, when people go back into the workplace. So, impaired performance impacts on risk management. In short, everything I've said up to now is basically all of this impacts on this. People coming into work with all these emotional constructs will ultimately impact on their decision-making capabilities, about the situational awareness, about how they communicate. Scott is going to talk a lot about those two areas, and I'm sure you're going to find that really interesting in terms of how Scott's going to broaden that to get you thinking about people's working memory and short-term memory, long-term memory, and how sort of anxiety and stress can impact on that. So these are the areas as risk managers we want to be thinking about. So how do we select the correct intervention then? Well, I'm going to go through this quite quickly, because in the course that we've developed, this is quite a big piece of work, but I'm going to try to show you it the best I can. And it was called The Behavioural Change Wheel, Mitchie and West 2014. It's a great book. I've already sort of highlighted that to you. If you really are interested in behavioural change, it's a kind of a go-to book, because it's proven. It's got you know, designed intervention functions against certain behaviours you're trying to look at. So what does it mean then? Well, if I can just show you this, the wheel itself is literally what it says. So in the centre, you've got the three constructs that kind of motivate or augment, sort of shape people's behaviour. You've got their capability, you've got their opportunity, and you've got motivation. So the capability, that's people's psychological capability. Have they got enough academic evidence to support that they're capable of doing the job? Are they understanding what they're being asked to do? Physically, can they do the job? Then you look at opportunity, social opportunity. That's kind of, kind of linked to what we've heard recently about herd behavior. People tend to copy off people. I've often asked people the question on training courses, why is it that when people go into a church, they whisper? There's no sign, there's no direct instruction, there's no order. And people often say, well, it's respect, it's showing respect when you go into a church. Well, respect for who? And where's this rule written? Well, it isn't a rule. What people tend to do is you get taught that's the thing to do, and then people copy that behavior. And that's great in the workplace if people are copying the right behaviors, but what if people are copying the wrong behaviors? Physical opportunity, well, we know all about that, don't we, at the moment? That is, are we providing the right tools, equipment for our workforce to do the job in the way, in the manner we're expecting them to do it in? And what's going on with the NHS at the moment, with in the care homes, with all of the PPE issues, how are we expecting these wonderful people to do the job that they're doing when they're not actually getting provided? They're having to make homemade kits and things like this. It's, so how do we expect people to behave in a certain way when we're not actually given the tools to do it? And then motivation, that is, automatic motivation and reflective motivation. Reflective motivation is what people are going through now, about thinking about things and about maybe overthinking things. And that's when people run distortion patterns in the mind, thinking about things that are actually never going to happen. And there's a famous saying about the devil plays in an idle mind. And a lot of people, I think, and the clients that I speak to at the moment, many are going through that at the moment. And then automatic motivation, is there a quicker way of doing this job? So around the side there, you've got intervention functions. So from the center of the wheel, you've got the outer part or the middle part of the wheel. And depending on which behavior you're trying to change, these proven intervention functions will help you develop those interventions as tools. And then the periphery of the wheel is how you're going to market it. So for the purposes of today's presentation, what we're going to particularly focus on is people's psychological ability. Yeah, psychological ability, and generally they're also their conscious and automatic decision-making capabilities. So when we run through the COM-B model with this, so what we have is the psychological capability of people goes into what's called a theoretical domains framework. Again, there's not enough time on today's presentation to explain what that all is, but what it talks about is, in order to change someone's psychological capability or their decision-making processes, theoretically, how can you do that? And then on the end, you've got intervention functions, either through training, environmental restructuring, and enablement. And at the end of the presentation today, we're going to give in a few takeaway messages and little tools and techniques to think about putting in place either during furlough or personal isolation, or when people come back to work. So all of that should be going into one of our risk assessments. So I know there's a number of people on the line who are safety professionals from a risk management point of view, but there's a number of people who aren't. And I'm conscious there's a number of people on this call who are from abroad, from the Far East, Asia, and from the Middle East. So, this is a UK piece of legislation that stipulates very clearly under the Management of Health and Safety Regulations that every employer shall make a suitable and sufficient assessment of the risk to the health and safety of their employees. So where it says his, please read his and her. It's not gender specific. But many employees we work with, and this has become a real issue over the last couple of years, about how employees, for many employers, for many years have shouted safety and whispered health. And what we're talking about today is really all about mental health and well-being. And where you've got more than 5 employees, an employer shall record the significant findings of the risk assessment. So now what we're armed with all this information, how are we going to record that then? Now, again, there's many different ways of doing a risk assessment. I'm very well aware of that. This is just a very, very basic run through of what a post-COVID-19 risk assessment could look like. So if I run through it, you've got the name of the assessor, the date, time, work area, and the task being assessed. And I've put the task down, returning employees back to work after a sustained period away from the workplace. So that is the task. So we've already said that there could potentially be problems academically, and research will suggest that when people come back to work after these prolonged periods, there is going to be an issue. So how are we going to manage it then? So the hazard, there's a potential for staff returning to work after a sustained period of absence to have personal, mental and or physical issues that may cause fatigue, loss of focus or distraction that could contribute to an incident. So who could be harmed? Potentially all members of the workforce, both those who have been absent from the workplace for a significant length of time and also the key workers that have remained. How might they be harmed? Well, it all depends on their activity. And again, you might want to do separate risk assessments depending on the functional role that somebody has in the workplace. But the harm category would generally fall into the mental and or physical harm to an existing person. What control measures, might a company have? Well, I've said the HR, return to work policies, sites, company specific inductions, company counselling. There's a lot now as well about mental health first aid. A lot of people have been trained in this in the last probably year and a half about, they're almost a signposting functionality or a kind of a person to go to be listened to, and where can you get more sort of help and support from. So many companies don't have them, many companies do. It's a fairly new concept that's been introduced quite recently. So on a scale of 1 to 5, how likely is it? Well, we know that it's not definite, but there's a reasonable chance. So on a scale of 1 to 5, many people coming back to work may be suffering with some form of stress or anxiety. And the consequence, well, again, it will depend on the job function. But if you've got somebody going out onto a petrochemical plant or an oil and gas sort of platform or something like that, doing isolations or a double block and bleed, well, the reality is, if that isn't being isolated properly because somebody's not focused and they're not aware of the situation, they're distracted, well, that could be a serious accident. From a more commercial point of view, if you've got somebody who's working in banking and they're doing a transaction and the mind's not on it, what if they put an extra zero onto something and 100,000 suddenly becomes 1 million? So from a financial risk, it depends on the job and what risks we're looking at. So that could come out as a potential 12. So what could we do additionally then? Well, there's all sorts of things. There's human factors training, a phased return to work pattern, focus on employees seeking help and reassurance, increased frequency of toolbox talks, communication meetings, increased supervision, sharing this risk assessment, meetings, open door policy. The leaders stepping up to the game, although those same people might be going through some of these emotional constructs themselves. So it's trying to adopt that caring and sharing type mentality. But again, Scott will talk more about that during his presentation. So dropping that if we do this and do it well, how could we manage that? Well, that could come out potentially as an 8 from a 12, and that might be a tolerable level of risk. And who would actually do that? Well, managers, team leaders, supervisors. How often? So again, it's just to give you an idea of what a post-COVID-19 risk assessment could look like based on bringing our employees back to the work area.